Question 1. Strategic planning requires FirstService employees to proactively manage potential conflicts of interest. If a client offers an employee a gift of significant monetary value during a routine business meeting, what is the most appropriate course of action for the FirstService employee to take to uphold regulatory compliance and ethical standards? Option A. Accept the gift and immediately inform the client that it will be donated to a charity of the employee's choice. Option B. Accept the gift, as it is a gesture of goodwill, and plan to disclose it to management later. Option C. Politely decline the gift, citing FirstService's gift policy, and thank the client for their generosity. Option D. Suggest a less valuable alternative gift that is more in line with typical client appreciation gestures. The correct answer is C. Politely decline the gift, citing FirstService's gift policy, and thank the client for their generosity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for FirstService employees regarding the ethical and regulatory implications of accepting gifts from clients. The core difficulty lies in balancing client relationship management with the imperative to avoid any perception or reality of undue influence or conflicts of interest. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of FirstService's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to ensure integrity and maintain public trust. The potential for even small gifts to create an appearance of impropriety necessitates a clear and consistent approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to FirstService's established gift policy, which likely prohibits accepting gifts of significant value or gifts that could be construed as influencing business decisions. This approach is right because it directly aligns with the principles of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance expected of financial services professionals. By refusing the gift and politely explaining the company policy, the employee upholds FirstService's commitment to transparency and avoids any potential conflicts of interest, thereby safeguarding both their professional reputation and the company's integrity. This proactive stance prevents any ambiguity or future accusations of favoritism. Incorrect approaches analysis. Accepting the gift, regardless of its perceived value, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of avoiding conflicts of interest and could be interpreted as a bribe or an attempt to unduly influence future business dealings, potentially contravening anti-bribery and corruption regulations. Furthermore, it undermines the trust that clients and the public place in FirstService as a reputable financial services provider. Attempting to negotiate the value of the gift or accepting it with the intention of donating it later without prior approval also poses risks. While seemingly well-intentioned, these actions bypass the established policy and still create an appearance of impropriety. They fail to address the core issue of accepting a gift that could be perceived as influencing business relationships and do not demonstrate a clear commitment to the company's ethical framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals at FirstService should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes adherence to company policy and ethical guidelines above all else. When faced with a situation involving potential gifts or benefits, the first step is to consult the relevant internal policies, such as the gift acceptance policy. If the policy is unclear or the situation is ambiguous, seeking guidance from a supervisor or the compliance department is crucial. The guiding principle should always be to act with integrity, transparency, and in a manner that avoids any appearance of impropriety or conflict of interest. This proactive and policy-driven approach ensures that professional conduct remains beyond reproach. Question 2. Strategic planning requires FirstService employees to proactively manage potential conflicts of interest. If a client offers an employee a gift valued at $150, which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Politely decline the gift, citing company policy regarding client interactions. Option B. Accept the gift and report it to the compliance department as per FirstService's gift policy. Option C. Accept the gift and keep it discreet to avoid any potential misunderstandings. Option D. Accept the gift immediately, as it is a common practice to show appreciation. Correct answer is D. Accept the gift immediately, as it is a common practice to show appreciation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for FirstService employees regarding the ethical and regulatory implications of accepting gifts from clients. The core difficulty lies in balancing client relationship management with the imperative to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain professional integrity. Employees must exercise sound judgment to discern when a gift crosses the line from a token of appreciation to something that could unduly influence their professional decisions or create the appearance of impropriety. This requires a nuanced understanding of FirstService's internal policies and relevant regulatory expectations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to FirstService's established gift policy, which likely outlines clear threshold and reporting requirements for gifts received from clients. This approach is right because it directly addresses the potential for conflicts of interest and upholds the company's commitment to ethical conduct. By following the policy, employees ensure transparency and accountability, preventing situations where their professional judgment might be compromised or perceived as compromised. This aligns with general principles of corporate governance and regulatory compliance, which emphasize integrity and the avoidance of undue influence in business dealings. Incorrect approaches analysis. Accepting a gift without considering its value or potential impact on professional judgment is an incorrect approach. This failure stems from a disregard for FirstService's internal policies and a lack of awareness of the ethical implications of accepting potentially influential gifts. It creates a significant risk of perceived or actual conflict of interest, undermining client trust, and potentially violating regulatory standards related to business ethics. Assuming that any gift from a client is acceptable as a gesture of goodwill, without consulting company policy or considering the context, is also an incorrect approach. This demonstrates a superficial understanding of ethical business practices and a failure to recognize that even seemingly small gifts can, in aggregate or in specific circumstances, create an appearance of impropriety or lead to preferential treatment. It bypasses the necessary due diligence required to maintain professional standards. Attempting to conceal the acceptance of a gift from a client, even if it falls within a gray area of the policy, is a serious ethical and regulatory failure. This action suggests an awareness that the gift might be problematic and a deliberate attempt to circumvent established procedures. Such concealment erodes trust, violates transparency principles, and can lead to severe disciplinary action and reputational damage for both the employee and FirstService. Professional reasoning. Professionals at FirstService should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to company policy and ethical guidelines. When faced with a gift from a client, the first step is to consult FirstService's specific gift policy. If the policy is unclear or the gift's value or nature raises concerns, the employee should err on the side of caution and seek guidance from their supervisor or the compliance department. This proactive approach ensures that decisions are made with full awareness of potential ethical and regulatory ramifications, fostering a culture of integrity and trust. Question 3. Strategic planning requires FirstService employees to maintain the highest standards of professional conduct. If a client offers an employee a valuable gift during a business meeting, what is the most appropriate course of action for the FirstService employee to take to ensure compliance with ethical guidelines and company policy? Option A. Accept the gift and assume it is a sign of appreciation that does not require further action. Option B. Politely decline the gift and explain that FirstService has a policy regarding client gifts. Option C. Accept the gift but plan to disclose it to management at a later date. Option D. Accept the gift as it is a small gesture and unlikely to influence business decisions. The correct answer is B. Politely decline the gift and explain that FirstService has a policy regarding client gifts. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for FirstService employees regarding the ethical and regulatory implications of accepting gifts from clients. The core difficulty lies in balancing client relationship management with the imperative to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain professional integrity. Employees must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between appropriate tokens of appreciation and gifts that could be perceived as influencing business decisions or creating an unfair advantage. This requires a nuanced understanding of FirstService's internal policies and relevant regulatory expectations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves politely declining the gift and explaining FirstService's policy on client gifts. This upholds the company's commitment to transparency and fairness. By adhering to a clear policy, FirstService demonstrates its dedication to avoiding even the appearance of impropriety, which is crucial for maintaining client trust and regulatory compliance. This proactive stance prevents potential conflicts of interest and ensures that all business decisions are made impartially, based on merit rather than personal inducements. This aligns with general principles of professional conduct and ethical business practices expected within regulated industries. Incorrect approach is analysis. Accepting the gift without question and failing to report it to management is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This action creates a direct conflict of interest, as the gift could be seen as a reward for past or future favorable treatment, compromising objective decision-making. It also violates the principle of transparency and could lead to accusations of favoritism or unethical business practices, potentially damaging FirstService's reputation and leading to regulatory scrutiny. Accepting the gift but intending to disclose it later without immediate reporting is also problematic. While disclosure is a step in the right direction, delaying it can still create a period of perceived conflict of interest. The immediate acceptance, even with the intention to disclose, can still influence the employee's mindset and potentially their interactions with the client during that interim period. Prompt reporting is essential to mitigate any potential for undue influence or the appearance of impropriety. Accepting the gift and rationalizing that it is a small gesture and unlikely to influence decisions is a dangerous form of self-deception that undermines ethical standards. Even small gifts can set a precedent and create a slippery slope towards more significant inducements. Regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines often focus on preventing the appearance of impropriety, not just actual wrongdoing. This approach fails to recognize the importance of maintaining a clear ethical boundary and could lead to a gradual erosion of professional integrity. Professional reasoning. Professionals at FirstService should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to company policy and ethical principles. When faced with a potential conflict of interest, such as receiving a gift from a client, the process should involve 1. Immediately recognizing the potential for conflict. 2. Consulting FirstService's established gift policy. 3. If the gift falls outside policy guidelines or creates ambiguity, politely declining it and explaining the policy. 4. If unsure, seeking guidance from a supervisor or the compliance department. This systematic approach ensures that actions are consistently aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical best practices, safeguarding both the individual and the company. Question 4. The audit findings indicate that FirstService may have inadvertently shared client financial information with an unauthorized third party during a recent vendor onboarding process. Which of the following represents the most appropriate immediate response to these findings? Option A. Immediately inform all clients about the potential data breach to maintain transparency, regardless of the confirmed severity. Option B. Instruct the IT department to delete all records related to the vendor onboarding process to prevent further scrutiny. Option C. Advise the audit team that the findings are likely a misunderstanding and do not warrant further action. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to determine the scope and nature of the potential data breach, consult with legal counsel, and prepare for potential regulatory reporting based on the investigation's outcome. Correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to determine the scope and nature of the potential data breach, consult with legal counsel, and prepare for potential regulatory reporting based on the investigation's outcome. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient operations with the stringent requirements of regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data handling and client confidentiality, as mandated by the FirstService hiring assessment test's implied jurisdiction, assumed to be U.S. federal regulations for financial services, given the context of a hiring assessment. The auditor's findings highlight a potential breach of these regulations, necessitating a careful and informed response. The correct approach involves a thorough internal investigation to ascertain the facts, followed by prompt and transparent communication with the relevant regulatory bodies if a breach is confirmed. This aligns with the principles of proactive compliance and accountability. Specifically, it adheres to regulations that require firms to maintain accurate records, protect client data, and report any significant compliance failures. The ethical imperative to act with integrity and transparency further supports this measured and responsible course of action. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings without proper investigation. This demonstrates a disregard for regulatory oversight and could lead to more severe penalties if a violation has indeed occurred. It fails to uphold the duty of care owed to clients and the regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately self-report to regulators without first conducting a thorough internal review. While transparency is important, premature reporting without a clear understanding of the facts can lead to unnecessary alarm, damage the company's reputation, and potentially result in a more critical regulatory response than warranted. It bypasses the due diligence expected in assessing the severity and nature of any potential issue. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to conceal or downplay the findings. This is a direct violation of ethical principles and regulatory requirements for honesty and cooperation with oversight. Such actions, if discovered, would lead to severe sanctions, including fines, reputational damage, and potential disqualification of personnel. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulations applicable to their industry and jurisdiction. They should then establish a clear process for internal investigations that is objective and thorough. This process should include gathering evidence, interviewing relevant personnel, and assessing the impact of any potential noncompliance. Based on the findings, a decision should be made regarding the appropriate course of action, which may involve corrective measures, internal disciplinary actions, or external reporting, always guided by legal counsel and compliance officers. Question 5. The performance metrics show that a candidate for a role at FirstService has achieved exceptionally high scores in preliminary screening stages, exceeding the typical benchmark for successful candidates. However, the FirstService hiring assessment test mandates a specific, multi-stage evaluation process that all candidates must complete, regardless of initial performance. Considering the regulatory framework governing this assessment, what is the most appropriate course of action for the hiring manager? Option A. Expedite the candidate's hiring process by bypassing certain assessment stages, given their superior preliminary performance metrics, to save time and resources. Option B. Rely on the candidate's strong external performance data to make an immediate hiring decision, assuming they will perform well in the role without completing the full FirstService hiring assessment test. Option C. Proceed with the candidate's assessment through all mandated stages of the FirstService hiring assessment test to ensure full compliance and a comprehensive evaluation. Option D. Request an exemption from the FirstService hiring assessment test for this candidate based on their high preliminary scores, thereby avoiding further assessment steps. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the candidate's assessment through all mandated stages of the FirstService hiring assessment test to ensure full compliance and a comprehensive evaluation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's operational efficiency and potential cost savings with the stringent regulatory obligations of FirstService. The core tension lies in interpreting and applying the specific requirements of the FirstService hiring assessment test regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes fairness, transparency, and adherence to established assessment protocols. A hasty decision based on incomplete data or a desire for expediency could lead to significant compliance breaches. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the FirstService hiring assessment tests, specific guidelines regarding performance metric interpretation, and their impact on candidate assessment. This approach prioritizes adherence to the established regulatory framework. It requires understanding how the metrics are defined within the context of the assessment, whether deviations are permissible, and what the documented procedures are for addressing such situations. The regulatory justification stems from the principle of consistent and fair application of assessment criteria as mandated by the testing framework. Any deviation without proper authorization or documented justification would undermine the integrity of the hiring process and potentially violate the assessment's governing rules. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings by bypassing a required assessment component for candidates with seemingly strong performance metrics would be a regulatory failure. This is because the FirstService hiring assessment test likely mandates specific stages or evaluations for all candidates, regardless of preliminary performance indicators. Failing to adhere to these mandated steps, even with the intention of efficiency, disregards the established protocol and could be interpreted as circumventing the assessment's purpose, which is to evaluate candidates against a defined standard. Another incorrect approach that involves making an assumption about the candidate's suitability based on external performance data, without verifying it against the FirstService hiring assessment test's internal criteria, is also a regulatory and ethical failure. This approach prioritizes external, unverified information over the prescribed assessment process. The regulatory failure lies in not following the defined assessment pathway, and the ethical failure is in potentially making a hiring decision based on incomplete or irrelevant information, which compromises the fairness and objectivity expected in a hiring process governed by a specific assessment framework. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the core issue. Recognize the discrepancy between observed performance metrics and the requirements of the FirstService hiring assessment test. 2. Consult the governing framework. Immediately refer to the specific regulations, guidelines, and procedures associated with the FirstService hiring assessment test. 3. Seek clarification. If the framework is ambiguous or does not directly address the situation, consult with the appropriate internal compliance or HR personnel responsible for the assessment. 4. Document all actions. Maintain a clear record of the observed metrics, the steps taken, any consultations, and the final decision, along with the justification based on the regulatory framework. 5. Prioritize compliance. Ensure that all decisions and actions are in strict adherence to the established regulatory requirement of the FirstService hiring assessment test. Question 6. Investigation of a potential conflict of interest at FirstService, where an employee discovers that a prospective vendor for a property management contract is owned by a close family member. The employee is involved in the vendor selection process. What is the most appropriate course of action for the FirstService employee? Option A. Inform the family member about the vendor selection process and offer to advocate for their company. Option B. Immediately disclose the relationship to their direct supervisor and the client, and request guidance on recusal or further steps. Option C. Wait to see if the family member's company is shortlisted before disclosing the relationship. Option D. Proceed with the vendor evaluation process as normal, assuming their professional judgment will remain unbiased. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the relationship to their direct supervisor and the client, and request guidance on recusal or further steps. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a FirstService employee because it requires navigating potential conflicts of interest and ensuring adherence to regulatory requirements regarding client confidentiality and disclosure. The employee must exercise careful judgment to uphold ethical standards and legal obligations. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the relevant parties within FirstService and the client, and seeking guidance on how to proceed. This demonstrates a commitment to transparency, ethical conduct, and compliance with regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure of situations that could impair objectivity or create a conflict. By seeking internal and external approval, the employee ensures that any actions taken are in accordance with FirstService's policies and relevant regulations, protecting both the company and the client from potential harm or legal repercussions. An incorrect approach of proceeding without disclosure risks violating regulations that require reporting of conflicts of interest. This failure to disclose can lead to accusations of impropriety, breach of trust, and potential disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the situation and hoping it resolves itself is equally problematic, as it bypasses established compliance procedures and leaves the company and client exposed to risks. Finally, an approach of only disclosing if directly asked fails to meet the proactive disclosure obligations inherent in ethical professional conduct and regulatory compliance. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, ethical conduct, and regulatory adherence. When faced with a potential conflict of interest, the first step should be to identify the nature of the conflict. Subsequently, employees should consult their company's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. The next crucial step is to proactively disclose the potential conflict to all affected parties and seek clear direction on how to proceed, ensuring that all actions are documented and approved. Question 7. Strategic planning requires FirstService to establish clear guidelines for employees regarding the acceptance of gifts from clients. Considering the regulatory framework and ethical obligations inherent in property management and financial services, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and upholds professional integrity? Option A. FirstService implements a comprehensive gift acceptance policy that outlines specific monetary limits, reporting requirements for all gifts received, and a clear process for seeking approval for any exceptions. Option B. The company relies on informal discussions among colleagues to determine the appropriateness of accepting client gifts without a formal policy or documentation. Option C. Employees are empowered to use their best judgment on a case-by-case basis, accepting gifts that are modest and do not appear to influence business decisions. Option D. Employees are encouraged to accept all client gifts as a gesture of goodwill, as this strengthens business relationships and is a common practice in the industry. The correct answer is C. Employees are empowered to use their best judgment on a case-by-case basis, accepting gifts that are modest and do not appear to influence business decisions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for FirstService employees regarding the ethical and regulatory implications of accepting gifts from clients. The core difficulty lies in balancing client relationship management with the imperative to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain professional integrity. As mandated by regulatory frameworks governing property management and financial services, the need for careful judgment arises from the subjective nature of what constitutes an inappropriate gift, and the potential for even seemingly minor tokens to influence decision-making or create the perception of undue influence. The correct approach involves a clear, documented policy that guides employees on gift acceptance, emphasizing transparency and adherence to established thresholds. This approach is professionally sound because it proactively addresses potential ethical breaches and regulatory noncompliance. Specifically, it aligns with principles of good corporate governance and the duty to act in the best interests of clients and stakeholders, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory bodies overseeing financial services and property management. By setting clear guidelines, FirstService demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and mitigates the risk of regulatory scrutiny or disciplinary action. An approach that involves accepting gifts without clear guidelines or reporting mechanisms is professionally unacceptable. This failure to establish and enforce a policy creates a significant risk of actual or perceived conflicts of interest, violating ethical standards and potentially contravening regulations that require transparency and fairness in business dealings. Such an approach could lead to accusations of favoritism, bribery, or other forms of misconduct, jeopardizing FirstService's reputation and leading to severe regulatory penalties. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on individual employee discretion without a formal policy. While employees may have good intentions, subjective judgment can be inconsistent and prone to error. This lack of a standardized framework leaves the company vulnerable to ethical lapses and regulatory noncompliance, as there is no objective basis for evaluating gift acceptance. It also fails to provide adequate protection for employees who might be pressured to accept gifts or who may misinterpret what is acceptable. Finally, an approach that involves accepting all gifts regardless of value or nature is also professionally unsound. This demonstrates a disregard for ethical considerations and the potential for conflicts of interest. It signals a lack of commitment to maintaining a professional distance and could erode client trust if it appears that business decisions are being influenced by personal gain. This approach directly undermines the principles of impartiality and fiduciary duty that are paramount in the property management and financial services sectors. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve consulting FirstService's internal policies on gift acceptance and conflicts of interest. If no clear policy exists, or if the situation is ambiguous, employees should err on the side of caution and seek guidance from their supervisor or the compliance department. The overarching principle should be to prioritize transparency, fairness, and the avoidance of any situation that could compromise professional integrity or create a conflict of interest. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that a senior executive at FirstService has requested immediate access to specific client financial data to prepare for an urgent board meeting. The executive states the information is critical for an upcoming decision. What is the most appropriate initial step to take? Option A. Acknowledge the request, clarify the specific data points and the exact purpose for their use, and then initiate the standard internal procedure for data retrieval and authorization. Option B. Inform the executive that the request cannot be fulfilled due to the urgency of the board meeting. Option C. Immediately access and provide the requested client financial data to the executive. Option D. Access the data and share it with the executive and other relevant department heads who might benefit from the information. The correct answer is C. Immediately access and provide the requested client financial data to the executive. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing data handling and client confidentiality. The pressure to provide a swift response to a senior executive can lead to shortcuts that violate compliance protocols, potentially resulting in significant legal and reputational damage for FirstService. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are compliant, even under pressure. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves acknowledging the request, immediately clarifying the scope and purpose of the information needed, and then initiating a compliant process to retrieve and share the data. This demonstrates adherence to regulatory frameworks by prioritizing data privacy and security. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that only necessary information is accessed and shared for a legitimate business purpose, and that appropriate authorization is sought if required. This proactive and compliant method protects FirstService from regulatory penalties and maintains client trust. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves immediately accessing and providing the requested client data without verification or authorization fails to respect data privacy regulations and internal FirstService policies. This bypasses necessary checks and balances, potentially exposing sensitive information inappropriately and violating confidentiality agreements. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request or delay a response significantly without explanation. While this avoids immediate regulatory breach, it demonstrates a lack of responsiveness and teamwork, which can negatively impact internal operations and the perception of compliance effectiveness within FirstService. It also fails to address the underlying business need that prompted the request. Finally, an approach that involves sharing the data with colleagues not directly involved in the request or who do not have a legitimate need-to-know basis is a clear violation of data protection principles and confidentiality obligations. This broadens the risk of data misuse and unauthorized disclosure, leading to potential regulatory sanctions and reputational harm for FirstService. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that prioritizes understanding the request's context and purpose before acting. This involves active listening, seeking clarification, and then consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations. If there is any doubt about the compliance of a proposed action, seeking guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is paramount. This ensures that decisions are not only efficient but also ethically sound and legally defensible, safeguarding both the individual and the organization. Question 9. When evaluating a potential new vendor for essential operational services, and it is discovered that this vendor also provides services to a significant number of FirstService's existing clients, what is the most appropriate course of action for FirstService to ensure regulatory compliance and maintain client trust? Option A. Inform the vendor that their existing client relationships are a concern and request they cease services to FirstService's clients before further consideration. Option B. Immediately disclose the vendor's relationship with clients to FirstService's compliance department for a thorough conflict of interest assessment and implement agreed-upon mitigation strategies. Option C. Accept the vendor's offer of a special discount for FirstService's business, as this represents a tangible benefit to the company. Option D. Proceed with the vendor selection process as planned, assuming that the vendor's existing client relationships do not inherently create a conflict for FirstService. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the vendor's relationship with clients to FirstService's compliance department for a thorough conflict of interest assessment and implement agreed-upon mitigation strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in regulatory compliance where a company, FirstService, must navigate potential conflicts of interest when engaging with a vendor that also provides services to its clients. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that all business decisions, particularly those involving vendor selection and contract terms, are made in the best interest of FirstService and its clients, free from undue influence or personal gain. Maintaining client trust and adhering to regulatory standards are paramount, requiring a robust framework for identifying, assessing, and mitigating such conflicts. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent process of disclosing the relationship, assessing the potential conflict of interest, and implementing appropriate safeguards. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory expectations for firms handling client assets or providing advisory services. Specifically, it requires a thorough review to determine if the vendor's relationship with FirstService's clients creates a material risk that FirstService's judgment or actions could be unduly influenced. If a conflict is identified, implementing measures such as obtaining client consent, ensuring competitive bidding processes, or even recusing relevant personnel from decision-making are crucial. This systematic approach ensures that FirstService upholds its fiduciary duties and complies with regulations designed to protect clients and maintain market integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the vendor without any disclosure or assessment of the conflict is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach disregards the potential for compromised decision-making and the appearance of impropriety, which can erode client trust and lead to regulatory sanctions. It violates the fundamental principle of acting in the best interest of the client and the firm. Accepting the vendor's offer of a special discount for FirstService without a clear understanding of how this discount impacts the overall cost to clients, or if it creates an incentive for FirstService to favor this vendor over others, is also problematic. This could be construed as an inducement that compromises objectivity and potentially violates regulations against receiving undisclosed benefits that could influence business decisions. The focus must remain on the value and suitability of the vendor's services for the clients, not on preferential treatment for FirstService. Ignoring the vendor's relationship with FirstService's clients and assuming no conflict exists is a failure of due diligence. Regulatory frameworks often require firms to actively identify and manage potential conflicts, rather than passively assuming their absence. This oversight can lead to situations where conflicts are not managed, resulting in harm to clients or the firm. Professional reasoning. Professionals at FirstService should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes transparency, objectivity, and client welfare. This involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest as early as possible. 2. Documenting the nature of the relationship and the potential conflict. 3. Conducting a thorough risk assessment to understand the potential impact on FirstService and its clients. 4. Developing and implementing a clear mitigation strategy, which may include disclosure, consent, or abstention from decision-making. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating conflict management policies and procedures. This structured approach ensures that FirstService operates with integrity and in compliance with all applicable regulations. Question 10. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for specific investment products within the retail sector. An employee at FirstService, while preparing a market analysis report, recalls a recent conversation with a client from a prominent hedge fund that discussed similar product interests. The employee is considering whether to incorporate insights from this conversation into the FirstService market analysis to provide a more nuanced perspective. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and ethical standards for FirstService employees? Option A. Anonymously aggregate the hedge fund client's stated product interests with similar, but unverified, observations from other client interactions to create a broader trend. Option B. Incorporate general themes and sentiments discussed with the hedge fund client into the market analysis, ensuring no specific client names or proprietary data are mentioned. Option C. Conduct the market analysis using only publicly available data and general industry trend reports, without referencing any client-specific information or discussions. Option D. Use the specific product preferences and investment strategies discussed with the hedge fund client to directly inform the market analysis, as this provides valuable, albeit non-public, insight. The correct answer is B. Incorporate general themes and sentiments discussed with the hedge fund client into the market analysis, ensuring no specific client names or proprietary data are mentioned. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an employee of FirstService to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with regulatory obligations, specifically concerning client confidentiality and fair dealing. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the desire to leverage market insights for for the company's benefit with the absolute necessity of protecting proprietary client information and adhering to ethical standards. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between permissible market analysis and impermissible use of confidential data. The correct approach involves FirstService employees conducting market research using publicly available data and general industry trends, without referencing or utilizing any non-public information obtained through their client relationships. This approach is right because it strictly adheres to regulatory frameworks that mandate client confidentiality and prohibit the misuse of insider information. By focusing solely on external, verifiable data, FirstService upholds its ethical duty to clients and avoids any appearance of impropriety or regulatory breach. This aligns with principles of fair competition and trust, which are foundational to the financial services industry. An incorrect approach would be to use insights derived from confidential client discussions or internal client data to inform the market research. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it constitutes a breach of client confidentiality, a fundamental obligation. It also potentially violates regulations against insider trading or unfair market advantage, depending on the specific nature of the information used. Another incorrect approach would be to infer market trends based on aggregated, anonymized data that still originates from FirstService's client base without explicit consent or proper anonymization protocols, as this could still inadvertently reveal patterns or sensitivities related to specific client segments. This risks violating privacy regulations and client trust. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves a clear understanding of what constitutes confidential information, a commitment to using only publicly available or legitimately obtained data for research, and a proactive approach to seeking guidance when in doubt. A robust internal compliance policy and regular training are crucial to reinforce these principles and ensure that employees can confidently distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable practices. Question 11. Analysis of a situation at FirstService where a hiring manager requests to expedite the hiring of a candidate by waiving the standard comprehensive background check, citing a tight deadline and a personal recommendation. How should a FirstService HR representative ensure compliance with the FirstService hiring assessment test regulatory framework, assuming U.S. federal and state employment laws apply? Option A. Inform the hiring manager that the standard background check is a mandatory part of the FirstService hiring process for all candidates and cannot be waived, and proceed with the standard procedure. Option B. Decline to hire the candidate immediately based on the hiring manager's request to bypass standard procedures without further investigation into the candidate's qualifications. Option C. Conduct a partial background check that is less thorough than the standard procedure but still includes some verification, to appease the hiring manager's request for expediency. Option D. Proceed with the expedited hiring process as requested by the hiring manager, documenting the manager's request and the reason for waiving the standard background check. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the expedited hiring process as requested by the hiring manager, documenting the manager's request and the reason for waiving the standard background check. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a FirstService employee due to the inherent conflict between client demands and regulatory obligations. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to maintain positive client relationships with the absolute requirement to adhere to the FirstService hiring assessment test specified regulatory framework, which in this context is assumed to be U.S. federal and state employment law. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to significant legal repercussions for both the individual and FirstService, including fines, lawsuits, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to identify and apply the correct legal standards without succumbing to client pressure. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and strict application of the FirstService hiring assessment test regulatory framework, specifically focusing on non-discriminatory hiring practices as mandated by U.S. federal and state employment laws. This approach prioritizes compliance by ensuring that all hiring decisions are based on objective, job-related criteria and are free from any form of unlawful discrimination based on protected characteristics such as race, gender, age, religion, or disability. This aligns with the ethical duty to uphold legal standards and protect FirstService from liability. An incorrect approach that involves accommodating the client's request to bypass standard background checks for a specific candidate, even if the client claims it's for expediency, is professionally unacceptable. This action directly violates the principle of consistent application of hiring policies and could be construed as discriminatory if the standard checks are applied to other candidates. It also exposes FirstService to potential liability if the candidate, who was not properly vetted, later causes harm or breaches company policy. Furthermore, ignoring established procedures undermines the integrity of the hiring process and sets a dangerous precedent. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with hiring the candidate without any further investigation, but to document the client's request, is also flawed. While documentation is important, it does not absolve FirstService of its responsibility to comply with regulations. Simply noting the client's preference does not negate the legal requirement for a fair and non-discriminatory hiring process. This approach fails to proactively address the potential compliance issue and leaves FirstService vulnerable to future challenges. A third incorrect approach, which is to refuse to hire the candidate solely based on the client's request without a valid, job-related reason, is also problematic. While the intention might be to avoid client interference, this approach could inadvertently lead to a claim of discrimination if the refusal is not based on objective, documented deficiencies in the candidate's qualifications or suitability for the role, as defined by FirstService's hiring criteria and relevant employment law. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of FirstService's internal policies and the applicable regulatory framework. When faced with a conflict, the professional should first identify the specific regulations or policies at play. Then, they should assess the client's request against these standards. If the request conflicts with regulations or policies, the professional should communicate the compliance requirements to the client, explaining the rationale and potential consequences of noncompliance. The focus should always be on finding a solution that upholds legal and ethical standards while striving to meet client needs within those boundaries. Escalation to a supervisor or legal counsel should be considered if the conflict cannot be resolved at the initial level. Question 12. Benchmark analysis indicates that during the FirstService hiring assessment test administration for a key management position, a candidate mentions a close personal relationship with a senior executive within FirstService. What is the most appropriate course of action for the assessment administrator to ensure compliance with the FirstService hiring assessment test's regulatory framework? Option A. Immediately pause the assessment and consult with the hiring manager and compliance department to clarify the nature of the relationship and determine if any specific protocols need to be followed to maintain assessment integrity. Option B. Discreetly note the candidate's statement and continue the assessment without further inquiry, relying on the standard evaluation criteria. Option C. Proceed with the assessment as scheduled, assuming the candidate's personal relationship will not influence their performance or the evaluation. Option D. Inform the candidate that their relationship may create a conflict of interest and suggest they withdraw from the assessment process. The correct answer is A. Immediately pause the assessment and consult with the hiring manager and compliance department to clarify the nature of the relationship and determine if any specific protocols need to be followed to maintain assessment integrity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the regulatory obligations of FirstService to ensure fair and transparent dealings. The need to balance client satisfaction with strict adherence to the FirstService hiring assessment test's regulatory framework requires careful judgment. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and addressing potential conflicts of interest by seeking clarification from the hiring manager regarding the candidate's relationship with FirstService. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance by prioritizing transparency and fairness in the assessment process. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of integrity and objectivity expected in hiring assessments, ensuring that all candidates are evaluated on merit without undue influence. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the assessment without disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the hiring manager is ethically unsound and violates the spirit of fair assessment. It risks creating an appearance of bias and could lead to a compromised evaluation, undermining the credibility of the hiring process. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately disqualify the candidate based on the perceived relationship without further investigation or consultation, is premature and potentially unfair. It fails to explore the nuances of the relationship and may deprive a qualified candidate of a fair opportunity, also potentially violating FirstService's commitment to merit-based hiring. A further incorrect approach, which is to ignore the information and proceed as if no relationship exists, is a direct contravention of the principles of transparency and due diligence. It actively conceals a material fact that could influence the assessment, leading to a breach of trust and potential regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. First, identify any potential conflicts of interest or information that could compromise the integrity of the assessment. Second, consult relevant internal policies and the FirstService hiring assessment test's regulatory guidelines. Third, seek clarification from appropriate stakeholders, such as the hiring manager or compliance department, to understand the nature and extent of any potential influence. Fourth, act with transparency and fairness, ensuring that the assessment process remains objective and unbiased. Question 13. Process analysis reveals that a client at FirstService is expressing strong interest in a particular investment product that offers a potentially attractive commission to the advisor. However, the advisor knows this product carries significant risks that are not immediately apparent and could lead to substantial losses for the client, especially given the client's conservative investment profile. The client is eager to proceed based on a superficial understanding of the product's upside. What is the most appropriate course of action for the FirstService advisor? Option A. Fully disclose all risks and potential downsides of the investment product to the client, ensuring they understand these aspects thoroughly before proceeding, even if it means the client decides against the investment. Option B. Emphasize the potential upside and attractive returns of the investment product to encourage the client to proceed, while briefly mentioning that all investments carry some risk. Option C. Decline to discuss the product further with the client, citing the need to focus on investments that align better with the firm's commission structure and suggest alternative products. Option D. Proceed with the sale of the investment product as the client is eager, assuming the client understands the inherent risks of investing in general. Correct answer is A. Fully disclose all risks and potential downsides of the investment product to the client, ensuring they understand these aspects thoroughly before proceeding, even if it means the client decides against the investment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's duty to act in the client's best interest, adhering to regulatory requirements. The advisor must navigate the potential for misrepresentation and ensure that the client's understanding of the investment's risks and benefits is accurate and not unduly influenced by the advisor's personal incentives. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves transparently explaining the limitations of the investment product to the client, highlighting potential downsides, and ensuring the client fully comprehends the risks involved, even if it means the client may not proceed with the investment. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of putting the client's interests first and adhering to regulatory mandates that require full disclosure and suitability. Specifically, under the FirstService hiring assessment test's implied regulatory framework, assumed to align with common financial advisory standards, this approach upholds the duty of care and the obligation to avoid misrepresentation. It ensures that the client makes an informed decision based on a complete understanding of the product's characteristics, thereby protecting both the client and the firm from potential regulatory breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach of downplaying the risks or exaggerating the potential returns to secure the sale would be a direct violation of the duty of care and could constitute misrepresentation. This would expose the advisor and FirstService to regulatory sanctions, client complaints, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach, that of refusing to discuss the product further due to the potential for a lower commission, would be a failure to act in the client's best interest and could be seen as a breach of fiduciary duty if applicable, or at least a failure to provide adequate service. This prioritizes the advisor's personal gain over the client's needs and the firm's commitment to client service. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the core ethical and regulatory obligations. 2. Assessing the potential impact of different actions on the client and the firm. 3. Seeking clarification or guidance if unsure about the appropriate course of action. 4. Communicating transparently and honestly with the client, even when the message may be difficult. 5. Documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 14. Research into FirstService's commitment to client advocacy. A junior associate discovers that a preferred vendor for property management software, with whom FirstService has a long-standing business relationship, offers the associate a significant personal referral bonus for introducing new clients. The associate believes this vendor's software is indeed the best option for the client they are currently advising. How should the associate proceed? Option A. Decline to recommend any software solution to avoid any appearance of impropriety, leaving the client to find their own solution. Option B. Recommend the vendor to the client, but only after thoroughly researching and documenting at least 2 other comparable software solutions to demonstrate a comprehensive evaluation. Option C. Recommend the vendor to the client without mentioning the referral bonus, assuming the software is genuinely the best fit and the bonus won't influence their decision. Option D. Disclose the potential referral bonus to the client and seek their explicit, informed consent before recommending the vendor. Correct answer is D. Disclose the potential referral bonus to the client and seek their explicit, informed consent before recommending the vendor. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing client interests with regulatory obligations and ethical conduct. The core dilemma lies in a potential conflict of interest and the duty to act in the best interest of the client, while adhering to FirstService's internal policies and relevant regulations. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands without compromising professional integrity or client trust. The correct approach involves transparently disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the client and seeking their informed consent before proceeding. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of putting the client's interests first and upholding fiduciary duties. It also adheres to regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure of conflicts to ensure clients can make informed decisions. By proactively addressing the situation, the professional demonstrates integrity and a commitment to client welfare, which is paramount in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach would be to proceed without disclosure, hoping the relationship with the vendor does not influence the recommendation. This fails to acknowledge the inherent risk of bias, even if unintentional. It violates the ethical duty of loyalty to the client and potentially breaches regulatory requirements concerning conflicts of interest and disclosure. Such an action erodes client trust and could lead to regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend the vendor without full consideration of alternative options, solely based on the existing relationship. This prioritizes convenience or personal benefit over the client's best interests and fails to meet the standard of providing objective, well-researched advice. It neglects the fiduciary duty to explore all suitable options to secure the most advantageous outcome for the client. A third incorrect approach would be to avoid the client altogether and not make a recommendation. While this avoids a direct conflict, it fails to fulfill the professional obligation to provide timely and appropriate advice. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to the client's needs and can be seen as an abdication of responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. 1. Identify the potential conflict of interest. 2. Assess the nature and significance of the conflict. 3. Consult internal policies and relevant regulations. 4. Determine the appropriate course of action, prioritizing client interests and transparency. 5. Disclose the conflict to the client and obtain informed consent if proceeding. 6. Document all decisions and communications. Question 15. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new, less expensive software system for client reporting at FirstService would significantly reduce operational expenses. However, a preliminary review suggests this system may not fully comply with certain data privacy regulations concerning client information storage and access, though the risk of detection is perceived as low. What is the most appropriate course of action for FirstService? Option A. Implement the new software system but instruct staff to manually circumvent any identified privacy concerns, assuming this will mitigate risk. Option B. Reject the new software system due to potential regulatory noncompliance and explore alternative cost-saving measures that do not compromise regulatory adherence. Option C. Proceed with the new software system, as the cost savings are substantial and the risk of regulatory noncompliance is minimal. Option D. Delay the decision until further analysis can definitively prove the software is non-compliant, accepting the current higher operational costs in the interim. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the new software system, as the cost savings are substantial and the risk of regulatory noncompliance is minimal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial benefits of a proposed action against potential long-term reputational damage and regulatory noncompliance. The pressure to achieve short-term financial gains for FirstService can create a conflict with the ethical duty to uphold regulatory standards and maintain client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not solely driven by cost-benefit calculations, but also by adherence to legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves prioritizing compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines, even if it means foregoing immediate financial advantages. This aligns with the fundamental principles of professional conduct, which mandate integrity, objectivity, and due care. Specifically, FirstService has a responsibility to ensure that its operations and advice to clients are not only financially sound, but also legally permissible and ethically defensible. Ignoring potential regulatory breaches, even if seemingly minor or unlikely to be detected, exposes the company and its employees to significant risks, including fines, sanctions, and loss of business. Upholding regulatory requirements is paramount to maintaining the company's license to operate and its reputation as a trustworthy service provider. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the proposed action solely based on the cost-benefit analysis, overlooking the potential regulatory implications. This demonstrates a failure to exercise due care and professional skepticism, as it prioritizes financial gain over legal and ethical obligations. Such a decision could lead to severe regulatory penalties, legal liabilities, and irreparable damage to FirstService's reputation, eroding client confidence and potentially leading to business failure. Another incorrect approach would be to rationalize the decision by assuming that the regulatory breach is minor or unlikely to be discovered. This reflects a lack of integrity and a disregard for the principle of acting in the best interests of clients and the public. Even if a breach is not immediately apparent, it still represents a violation of established rules and can have serious consequences if uncovered. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant legal and ethical obligations. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of the potential consequences of any proposed action, considering not only financial impacts, but also regulatory, legal, and reputational risks. If a proposed action appears to conflict with any regulatory requirement or ethical principle, it should be rejected or modified to ensure full compliance. Seeking advice from legal counsel or compliance officers is crucial when there is any doubt about the legality or ethicality of a proposed course of action. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that transparency in vendor selection significantly impacts client satisfaction and trust in property management firms. An employee at FirstService has identified a new vendor who can offer a significant cost saving on a recurring service for a client. However, this vendor also offers a commission to FirstService for each contract secured. The employee is aware that disclosing this commission might lead the client to question the recommendation, even though the cost savings are substantial. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible approach for the FirstService employee in this situation? Option A. Fully disclose the commission structure to the client, explain the cost savings, and recommend the vendor, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Option B. Recommend the vendor based on the cost savings, but omit the detail about the commission FirstService would receive to avoid potential client skepticism. Option C. Proceed with engaging the vendor without explicitly informing the client about the commission, assuming the cost savings are sufficient justification. Option D. Decline to use the new vendor to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest, even if it means the client misses out on significant cost savings. The correct answer is A. Fully disclose the commission structure to the client, explain the cost savings, and recommend the vendor, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at FirstService due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the company's potential financial gain. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to act in the best interest of the client, while also adhering to company policies and ethical standards. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's financial well-being and transparency. This means clearly disclosing the potential cost savings and the associated commission structure to the client, allowing them to make an informed decision. This aligns with the ethical duty of loyalty and acting in the client's best interest, which is a cornerstone of professional conduct in the property management industry. Regulatory frameworks often emphasize fiduciary duties and the avoidance of conflicts of interest, requiring full disclosure when such conflicts might arise. An incorrect approach would be to downplay the commission or omit its disclosure. This failure constitutes a breach of transparency and potentially a violation of fiduciary duties, as it misleads the client about the full financial implications of the proposed solution. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the vendor without client consent, which disregards the client's autonomy and right to approve expenditures, and could violate contractual obligations and industry best practices. Finally, prioritizing personal gain over client benefit, even if not explicitly illegal, is ethically unsound and erodes trust, which is detrimental to both the client relationship and FirstService's reputation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This is followed by a thorough understanding of all relevant contractual obligations, company policies, and ethical guidelines. The next step is to consider the impact of each potential decision on the client's interests, and then to communicate transparently with the client, providing all necessary information for them to make an informed choice. If a conflict cannot be resolved ethically or transparently, seeking guidance from a supervisor or legal counsel is paramount. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that a key client of FirstService, who is seeking to secure additional financing, has requested that their recent quarterly financial reports be presented in a manner that highlights positive trends, even if it means downplaying certain operational challenges that have impacted profitability. The client has explicitly asked for a rosier picture to be painted for the lenders. Option A. Politely explain to the client that while FirstService is committed to supporting their financing efforts, the company cannot misrepresent financial data and must present accurate information in accordance with professional standards and regulatory requirements. Option B. Provide the client with the raw, unadjusted financial data and leave it to them to interpret and present it to the lenders as they see fit. Option C. Agree to the client's request and adjust the financial reports to emphasize positive aspects, omitting or minimizing the impact of operational challenges. Option D. Immediately escalate the situation to senior management without directly addressing the client's request, assuming the client's intentions are malicious. The correct answer is A. Politely explain to the client that while FirstService is committed to supporting their financing efforts, the company cannot misrepresent financial data and must present accurate information in accordance with professional standards and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at FirstService due to the potential conflict between a client's request and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The core of the dilemma lies in balancing client satisfaction with the duty to uphold professional standards and avoid misrepresentation. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising FirstService's integrity or violating applicable regulations. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request to misrepresent information. This upholds the principle of honesty and integrity, which are fundamental ethical requirements in the property management industry. Specifically, it aligns with the expectation of providing accurate and truthful information to all stakeholders, including clients, residents, and regulatory bodies. Misrepresenting financial performance or operational status would be a breach of trust and could lead to regulatory scrutiny, reputational damage for FirstService, and potential legal repercussions. Adhering to professional codes of conduct, which typically mandate transparency and accuracy, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to agree to the client's request to inflate figures. This is ethically unsound as it involves deception and misrepresentation. It violates the duty of candor and could lead to a breach of contract if the misrepresented information is relied upon by others. Furthermore, It exposes FirstService to significant regulatory risk, as such actions could be construed as fraudulent or misleading, potentially resulting in fines, sanctions, or loss of license. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's request and proceed with providing the accurate, but potentially disappointing, information without any attempt to explain or manage expectations. While truthful, this approach lacks professional diplomacy and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily. A more nuanced approach that acknowledges the client's concerns while still adhering to ethical and regulatory standards is preferable. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of the request. 2. Consulting relevant company policies and professional codes of conduct. 3. Communicating clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the limitations and ethical boundaries. 4. Seeking guidance from supervisors or legal counsel if the situation is complex or carries significant risk. 5. Prioritizing honesty, integrity, and compliance above short-term client appeasement. Question 18. Regulatory review indicates that a client of FirstService is requesting that a property condition report be altered to omit a significant structural defect that has been identified. The client believes that disclosing this defect will negatively impact their ability to sell the property at their desired price. Option A. Suggest to the client that they obtain an independent report from another firm that may have different reporting standards. Option B. Proceed with the original report but avoid mentioning the structural defect in any verbal communication with the client, hoping they will not notice its omission. Option C. Agree to the client's request and modify the report to exclude the identified structural defect, assuring the client that this will help facilitate the sale. Option D. Politely inform the client that the report cannot be altered to omit material facts, as this would violate professional standards and potentially regulatory requirements, and offer to discuss alternative solutions for addressing the defect. The correct answer is D. Politely inform the client that the report cannot be altered to omit material facts, as this would violate professional standards and potentially regulatory requirements, and offer to discuss alternative solutions for addressing the defect. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at FirstService due to the potential conflict between a client's request and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The core of the dilemma lies in balancing client satisfaction with the duty to uphold professional standards and avoid misrepresentation. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising integrity or violating established guidelines. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request to misrepresent information. This upholds the principle of honesty and integrity, which are fundamental ethical tenets in professional services. Specifically, it aligns with the regulatory framework that prohibits misleading statements or omissions of material fact. By explaining that such a misrepresentation would violate company policy and potentially regulatory requirements, the employee demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and professional responsibility. This approach prioritizes transparency and accuracy, ensuring that FirstService maintains its reputation for trustworthiness. An incorrect approach would be to agree to the client's request, even with reservations. This directly violates the ethical obligation to be truthful and accurate. It also exposes FirstService to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties for misrepresentation. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request and proceed without addressing the client's concern. This fails to manage the client relationship effectively and could lead to dissatisfaction or future disputes. Furthermore, it bypasses the opportunity to educate the client on proper procedures and ethical boundaries. A third incorrect approach might be to attempt a creative interpretation of the facts that is technically true but misleading. This still falls short of the ethical standard of full transparency and can be perceived as deceptive, undermining trust, and potentially leading to regulatory issues. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the client's underlying need or concern. Then, they should assess the request against their company's policies, ethical codes, and relevant regulations. If the request conflicts with these standards, the professional should clearly communicate the limitations and explain the reasons why the request cannot be fulfilled, referencing specific policies or regulations where appropriate. The focus should always be on finding a solution that is both compliant and addresses the client's legitimate needs within ethical boundaries. Question 19. Consider a scenario where a FirstService property manager, while reviewing tenant lease agreements, discovers information suggesting a tenant may be engaging in illegal activities that could pose a significant safety risk to other residents in the building. The property manager is aware of the tenant's right to privacy, but also recognizes the potential danger to the community. Option A. Confront the tenant directly about the suspected illegal activities to gather more information before deciding on any further action. Option B. Consult with their direct supervisor and FirstService's legal department to discuss the findings and determine the appropriate course of action, adhering to company policy and relevant regulations. Option C. Ignore the information, assuming it is not their responsibility to investigate or report potential illegal activities, and continue with routine property management duties. Option D. Immediately report the suspected illegal activity to law enforcement and building security without further investigation or consultation. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the suspected illegal activity to law enforcement and building security without further investigation or consultation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing client confidentiality with the potential need to disclose information that could prevent harm. The FirstService employee is in a position of trust, and their actions must align with both ethical obligations and any applicable regulatory frameworks governing their profession. The core of the dilemma lies in determining when the duty to protect a client's privacy is superseded by a duty to warn or protect others from potential harm. Careful judgment is required to navigate this complex ethical landscape without violating professional standards or legal requirements. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the situation, seeking guidance from supervisors or legal counsel, and acting in accordance with FirstService's internal policies and relevant professional codes of conduct. This approach prioritizes a measured and informed response, ensuring that any disclosure is made only when absolutely necessary and legally permissible, thereby upholding both client trust and public safety. Specific regulatory or ethical justification would stem from professional codes of conduct that often outline a duty to warn or protect when there is a clear and imminent danger, while also emphasizing the importance of confidentiality. An incorrect approach of immediately disclosing the information without proper assessment or authorization would violate client confidentiality, potentially leading to legal repercussions and damage to FirstService's reputation. Failing to consult with supervisors or legal counsel before acting demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and adherence to established protocols. Another incorrect approach of doing nothing, despite recognizing a potential risk, could be seen as a breach of professional duty if there is a clear and actionable threat that could have been reasonably addressed. This inaction could have severe consequences for potential victims and expose FirstService to liability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical and legal obligations at play. This involves understanding the scope of confidentiality, identifying potential risks, and recognizing any exceptions to confidentiality that might apply. Seeking consultation with experienced colleagues, supervisors, or legal experts is a crucial step in complex situations. Documenting all steps taken and the rationale behind decisions is also essential for accountability and review. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not made impulsively, but are grounded in professional standards and a thorough understanding of the circumstances. Question 20. The assessment process reveals that a candidate applying for a role at FirstService has identified a significant gap between their current skill set and a specific technical requirement mentioned in the job description. The candidate is concerned this gap will lead to their immediate disqualification. What is the most ethical and professionally sound approach for the candidate to take in this situation? Option A. Focus solely on their strengths and attempt to steer the conversation away from the technical requirement, assuming the interviewer will overlook the deficiency if other aspects of their application are strong. Option B. Exaggerate their experience in related areas to imply proficiency in the required technical skill, hoping the interviewer will not be able to discern the difference. Option C. Honestly acknowledge the gap in their skill set and express a proactive plan for how they intend to acquire the necessary skills, such as through further training or self-study, demonstrating a commitment to professional development. Option D. Strategically omit the specific technical requirement from their resume and application, hoping that the interviewer will not probe deeply into that particular area. Correct answer is C. Honestly acknowledge the gap in their skill set and express a proactive plan for how they intend to acquire the necessary skills, such as through further training or self-study, demonstrating a commitment to professional development. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a candidate's desire to impress and the ethical obligation to provide accurate and truthful information during a hiring assessment. The pressure to secure a position at FirstService can lead individuals to consider misrepresenting their qualifications or experience. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation ethically and professionally, adhering to the principles of honesty and integrity that are fundamental to the financial services industry, and specifically to the FirstService hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. The correct approach involves acknowledging the candidate's perceived shortcomings honestly and seeking to address them through legitimate means, such as further training or development, rather than fabricating experience. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on truthfulness in all dealings and the ethical guidelines that prohibit misrepresentation of qualifications. By being upfront, the candidate demonstrates integrity, a key attribute valued by employers and regulators. This approach fosters trust and allows for a realistic assessment of their suitability for the role, promoting a fair and transparent hiring process. An incorrect approach would be to embellish or fabricate experience to meet perceived requirements. This directly violates the principle of honesty and could lead to severe consequences, including disqualification from the assessment, damage to reputation, and potential regulatory sanctions if the misrepresentation were to occur in a regulated capacity. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the perceived gap and hope it goes unnoticed. This demonstrates a lack of self-awareness and a failure to proactively address potential weaknesses, which is unprofessional and undermines the integrity of the assessment process. Finally, attempting to deflect or blame others for the perceived lack of experience is also an unprofessional and unethical response, as it avoids personal accountability. Professionals should approach such situations by first honestly assessing their own strengths and weaknesses relative to the requirements of the role. If a gap is identified, the decision-making process should involve considering how to legitimately bridge that gap through further learning, skill development, or seeking mentorship. Transparency and honesty are paramount throughout the hiring process, and any attempt to mislead an employer is a serious ethical and professional failing.